It is my honor to introduce Matt Friedman. He is an international human trafficking expert with more than 30 years of experience. He is the CEO of the Mekong Club, which is an organization of Hong Kong's leading businesses, which have joined forces to help end all forms of modern slavery. Mr. Friedman previously worked for USAID and the United Nations in over 30 countries. Mr. Friedman offers technical advice to numerous governments, banks, and corporations working to eliminate all forms of modern slavery, and is the author of 12 books. Thanks for being here, Matt. You have the floor.
Thank you very much for the opportunity, and I really appreciate the chance to speak to you all. I'm going to start off by kind of giving a quick overview of kind of my perspective on human trafficking, kind of a 101, and then I'm going to switch over to the private sector and how the private sector is involved in this. But you know, when you start with an issue like this, most people, when they think about human trafficking, are thinking of the top left-hand photo for forced prostitution. For good reason. There are 4.2 million women and girls in forced prostitution around the world. My first exposure to this was about 30 years ago. I was living and working in Nepal. I was a public health officer, and it was my job to translate resources into healthier people. What we were finding were girls that were 12, 13 years old who were HIV positive, didn't understand what was going on. It's a very conservative culture. So we went to go and interview them, and we heard the same story and over again. It went something like this. Human trafficker would go into a village, flash a bunch of money around, say he's looking for a wife. He'd find a girl 12, 13 years old, befriend her, go to the family and say, I'd like to marry your daughter. They're like, wow, he's rich, he's handsome, he's going to take care of us, going to take care of the daughter. 2 days later, they actually go through a wedding ceremony. After that, he goes to the family and says, I'm going to take your daughter to Kathmandu, but don't worry, I'll be back in 3 months. But that isn't what's going to happen. Instead, he takes her to Mumbai, India, to the red light district. He puts her in a room and he says, honey, stay here. I'll be back in a few minutes. He then goes off to the madam to get the $500 for having sold her to the brothel. He has the gold from the wedding, and he hands the wedding pictures over to her as well. She then goes into the room where the girl is and says, guess what? Your husband just sold you to me, and you're going to be with 20 guys a day because I say so. You can imagine her shock. No. He loves me. No, that's not the case. When she comes to internalize what's going on, many of the girls say, I will kill myself before I do those shameful things. The madam then brings out the photo of the family and says, is this your mother, your father, your brother? If you hurt yourself, we'll hurt them. So she's trapped in this situation. In order to make her into a prostitute, it's quite simple. You bring in a couple of professional rapists, and over a 2-day period of time, they'll take this 12-year-old girl, rape her 30 times until eventually she just lays back, accepts what happens to her, and then for a couple of years, she does this until she's worn out spiritually, emotionally, and physically, and they throw her out onto the street. So I was hearing this story over and over again, but I didn't understand the evil of it until I actually went to those brothels. I was invited by the Indian government to do public health checks. I had a police officer with me, went into one of the brothels, and there was an 11-year-old trafficking victim. This girl saw this Caucasian guy, saw an opportunity, literally ran up and wrapped herself around me and said, save me, they're doing terrible things to me. I looked down at this child who was hysterically crying, turned to the police officer and said, we need to get this girl out of here. Said, we can't do that. So what are you talking about? You're a cop. Says if we try to leave, we'll both be killed. To make a long story short, we left, we came back, but of course she was gone. We had many other police with us. Now I tell this story because I wasn't one of those 15-year-olds that said, when I grow up, I want to be an activist. In fact, I did everything I could not to be. But every once in a while, we are tested in life. That was my big test. I failed miserably. And after that, I couldn't eat, I couldn't sleep, I had nightmares, and did what a lot of activists do. I surrendered to the fact that now that I know about this, I can't turn my back. And 30 years later, here I am talking to you. But it's not just women and girls, it's men and boys. You see a fishing trawler here. The story behind this is a Cambodian boy is told by his family, you got to go to Thailand and get a job and send money home. He goes to Thailand, he's looking for work, not finding it. Eventually, he's running out of money. Human traffickers see this. They go up to him and say, hey, brother, you're from Cambodia. I'm from Cambodia. Let me help you out. Let me give you some money. Okay, well, now that you have my money, you have to stay with me. But guess what? I'm going to take you down to the ocean. I'm going to get you a job. You're going to go out for a couple of months on a boat. You're going to come back. You're going to catch a bunch of fish. They're going to give you a lot of money. You're going to be a hero to your family. Life is good. So they go down. He doesn't realize he's been sold onto the boat. He goes onto the boat goes out, but it doesn't come back after 3 months. It stays out for 4 years. This poor kid will end up working 16, 17, 18 hours a day, every day. If he doesn't, he gets beaten, he gets tortured. The only food he will eat the entire time he's there is rice and fish. Nothing nutritious, no fruits and vegetables. They give him strong stimulants to get him to work. If he gets ill, if he gets sick, they throw him off the side of the boat. At the end of the 4 years, the boat comes in, the guy goes to the captain and says, give me something. Captain says, go away. You're illegally in my country. Guy says, I'm going to tell the police. Captain says, go ahead. We own the police. Another example of human trafficking. These represent just a couple of examples of what human trafficking looks like. To put this into perspective, and you probably heard this numbers, the number of people who fall into human trafficking now are about 40 million people. In fact, there are more slaves today than any other time in history. There's more slaves than there are Canadians. When it comes to where I live, about 62% of the people who are in this situation are in Asia, basically for 2 reasons. Number one, there's a lot of people in Asia. You have China, 1.4 billion people, India, 1.3 billion people. Then you have Bangladesh and Indonesia and Japan. All those countries have amazing populations. In addition to that, though, you have feudal systems that have never been completely dismantled. And I would argue that you have the same situation in Africa, Latin America, and all over the world. When it comes to the rate of people entering into modern slavery, it's estimated around 9.2 million per year, about 25,200 per day. In the time it takes me to do this presentation, about 600 new people or a new slave every 4 seconds. So if I count to 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, somewhere in the world, somebody's entering modern slavery, and the drum beats on and on and on. With COVID, we expect the numbers to go up significantly. Why? People aren't working. They're sent home. They need that paycheck. After a couple of weeks of not working, you tap into your savings, you deplete them, you borrow money, and that is a big formula for allowing a person to eventually be used by human traffickers. So we expect that the number could go from 40 million, some estimates say up to as much as 60 million. When it comes to the ages, about a quarter of the cases are children, the rest are adults. Most people think that human trafficking is predominantly forced prostitution. That only represents about 20% of the cases. The rest of the cases are forced labor cases. And as it relates to us, 64% of the forced labor cases are associated with supply chains, where we get our electronics, our clothes, our food, our fish. So we as consumers, by buying things, are actually contributing to the problem. And that's a very relevant point, because like the climate change, where there's the carbon footprint and our contribution, once people begin to accept some responsibility because they're contributing to it, then all of a sudden you get more people involved. When it comes to who's supposed to address this issue, well, it's supposed to be governments, but many governments don't like this topic. It's embarrassing for the government of Thailand and China and Indonesia and Australia and the UK to have slaves. Things are done, but usually not enough to really make a difference. I think the United States and a couple of other countries are exceptions where there is a strong emphasis on this, but many country governments don't do much. I worked for the United Nations for 6 years. I'll put my hand on my heart when I say this. I believe in the United Nations system, but I spent a lot of time in 5-star hotels eating really good food, talking about poverty. There was a real disconnect between what we were supposed to do and what we were actually doing. So it's the non-government organizations that are really doing the lion's share of the work. But when you stop and look at the statistics again, if 81% of what we're talking about is forced labor and 64% of that is associated with supply chains, private sector needs to be involved in this. But if you think governments don't like this topic, the private sector hates it because they're often on the receiving end of somebody wagging a finger and saying to them, you guys are so greedy that you would use slavery for your shareholder profits. Now, in reality, this is not the case. Responsible companies would never do that, but that's what consumers believe. I'll come back to that point a little bit later. So let's look at the report card for last year. The number of people that were helped out of modern slavery, out of 40 million, and the number of criminals that were put in jail out of the 500,000 that are out there. And these are the statistics. About 108,000 or 0.2% of the trafficking victims helped, not even 0.5%. Out of 8,000 criminals, about out of 500,000 criminals, 8,000, 0.8%. Now, if you look at this, you might ask the question, does the counter-trafficking world not care? Are they lazy? Are they not doing their job? That's not the issue here. The issue is that the profits generated from modern slavery are estimated to be 150 billion US dollars. The amount of money to fight it is about 350 million or 0.23% of the profits. To put this into perspective, in the United States, we eat a lot of potato chips, $6 billion worth. It takes 21 days of potato chip eating to come up with the amount of money that's used globally to address modern slavery. The other thing is the scale. There's about 20,000 do-gooder types like me around the world focusing on this, going against 500,000 greed incentivized criminals. We have to follow the rules. They don't. And lastly, awareness related to this is very low. I've gone all over the world talking about this issue. Everywhere I go, most people don't know much about the topic. So how did the private sector get involved in this? Well, the number 0.2, when governments around the world realized that the NGOs and the United Nations and the governments were having very little impact, and they realized that the private sector had a role to play, they put systems and procedures in place that kind of incentivized and created almost a business risk that pushed the private sector in. The first thing that happened is around 2012, you saw legislation, transparency legislation, like the California Transparency in Supply Chain Act. You saw the UK Modern Slavery Act. Basically, these acts say if you're a big company and you have any products in those countries, you have to put on your website what you do to address modern slavery. This allows consumers to see what's happening. There were major lawsuits against usually retailers, large retailers like Tesco and Walmart, because they were buying seafood from Thailand, and people said, well, that's tainted by modern slavery. And so you guys need to go and do something to address it. We're seeing news coverage double almost every year for the past 7 years now. So every year, more and more stories are coming out simply because people are interested in the topic. When it comes to ESG, which is the governance side of determining whether a company is doing the right thing, E is environmental, G is governance, S is social, investment companies are beginning to ask questions about how do we know we're not investing in companies that are supporting this, because their investees are asking these questions. So if these things don't come together, sometimes this leads to all kinds of pain and suffering for companies because they can be named and shamed and boycotted and so forth. So the various sectors that we work with that are addressing this, number one, the banks. Now people would say, why would the banks be concerned about this? Well, if $150 billion is generated from modern slavery and any of that money gets into a legitimate bank, it's money laundering. So the banks have to be concerned about this. When it comes to manufacturing, they have supply chains, and the supply chains they have go down to tier 1, which is where they assemble it, tier 2, where the component parts come from, tier 3. Most companies know what's happening at tier 1. They've been auditing that for years, but they don't know what's happening below that. So this creates a vulnerability. So many companies are trying to map out and understand what's happening in their supply chains. When it comes to retailers, as I mentioned, you have lawsuits that are taking place. These lawsuits get into the newspaper, become very embarrassing for these companies. And a lot of the retailers don't really know how to address this. How do they use the pressure that they have? So they're exploring those types of things. And lastly, when it comes to the hotel or hospitality sector, they have supply chains because they buy seafood. They have third-party contracts for people who clean the facilities and work there. They have construction that could have human trafficking associated with it. And they also have the possibility of forced prostitution. So all of these things create vulnerabilities that push the private sector in the direction of needing help in order to address it. So the organization I work with is called the Mekong Club. And basically what we do is work with the private sector in a positive, supportive way to help them to understand the issue of human trafficking, and then to basically face this in a way that allows them to protect their organization. We're an association, which means that we have members. Our members, about 50 of them, most of them would be Fortune 500 companies, but they're divided into 4 categories: finance, footwear and apparel, which would be manufacturing, hospitality, and retail. The reason why we have the name, the Mekong Club, well, actually, because the people who set up this organization said, if you have human rights or human trafficking in the name, the private sector won't sign up. It'll scare them away. It'll be a business risk to even join, because people will say, are you joining that organization because you have a problem? And so that's the reason why we came up with that. On a quarterly basis, these individuals come together, they meet, they discuss, they debate, and they identify what's needed to address the problem. So they develop suggestions of tools. One of the tools they wanted was e-learning. So we developed 15 3.5-minute films in multiple languages, including Thai, Mandarin, Cantonese, Vietnamese, Burmese, etc. They wanted a dashboard that would allow for them to identify risk factors related to trafficking in persons report, slavery index, as well as commodities that basically have been tainted by modern slavery, so they could get a coefficient of exploitation vulnerability that they could use to determine decisions on whether they move forward. The banks wanted what are called typology reports, reports that break down the criminal activity into component parts and then identify transactions that could be identified as red flag transactions. So if you look at these transactions in your system, you might find something nefarious that's taking place, and so on and so on. And so all of these tools, and we have about 30 of them, basically address different elements of what the private sector needs. They suggest it, we build it, we give it back to them, and then as a result of this, we're able to protect the organizations. So I'm going to just say a couple more things before I close. I'm running out of time. And this gives you a sense of my philosophy on human trafficking. So years ago, when I was still working in Nepal, I was hearing these stories over and over again, and I desperately wanted to do something to address the issue. So I decided to write a book. So as part of this book writing process, I would go from shelter to interview the women and the girls. I went to one shelter and there was a girl named Geeta. And every time I approached her, she said, no, I don't want to give my story. But as I interviewed everyone else, she sat and listened to everything I was saying. When I finished there and I was leaving, Geeta comes running up and says, I changed my mind. You could have my story. I was thrilled. So she sat on one side of the table. The rest of us sat on the other side of the table. And over a 3-hour period, she told the worst story I had ever heard of rape and torture, betrayal and murder, everything I had heard times 10. I honestly didn't know what to say. Finally, I turned to her and I said, wow, Geeta, you must be so angry at those traffickers for the horrific things they did to you. She paused. And then she said, no, I'm angry at you and you and you. She pointed at us. She said, where were you? Said that every single day she prayed for somebody to come. Nobody came. She said she went to school till she was 12. She knew everything around her was right out in the open. Nobody was doing anything. She said she wasn't angry at the traffickers. She said they're just bad people being bad people. She said she was angry at the good people, at society, for not caring enough to allow a 15-year-old girl to be commercially raped 7,000 times only to get AIDS and eventually die. So I tell this story because Geeta inherently understood that the only way we're going to be able to address this issue is if the world accepts some responsibilities, not just the NGOs or the governments or the United Nations, but the private sector, the faith-based groups, and the general public. And if we could get everyone to understand the relevance and the importance of this, perhaps that would make a difference. I have time for one more story, and this is a private sector story. So I did a banking conference where I finished a talk in front of a bunch of bankers, and this guy comes running up and says, Matt, I want to talk to you. I said, sure, that happens a lot after presentations. He said, I was taking my family, my wife and 2 daughters, teenage daughters, from one part of the country to another. About halfway there, drove into a motel, got them settled. I was leaving, and as I was leaving, there was this 14-year-old girl who's being pulled into a room, looked like forced prostitution. I was very bothered because I had daughters. So I went to the manager of the hotel. I explained to her what happened. I went back to my room, not knowing if anything would happen. Sure enough, 20 minutes later, the cops came. 20 minutes later, that guy was being taken out in handcuffs. The girl was being taken away in an unmarked car. I thought she was going to a shelter. He said that was a milestone in my life. It was a highlight of my life. I wanted to tell you that story. So I turned to him and I said, well, what do you do? He says, well, I'm a banker. And I said, yeah, you're at a banking conference. I get that. But what do you do within banking? And he says, he's an analyst. He looks at, money laundering and fraud and criminal activity and so forth. And I turned to him and I said, would you deal with human trafficking cases? And he says, yes, we find them and then we submit reports to law enforcement. So I turned to him and I said, dude, you do this all the time. You are basically helping people with your job. Didn't you make that connection? You may not see it the same way you saw that girl being helped, but by you contributing and being a part of the solution and looking at these legal systems, you are helping many people. It was like an epiphany for him. So a couple of months later, I was in front of the Singapore Banking Association. I told them this story and I told them how he was heroic and anyone who does this work is heroic and you guys are really making a difference. And afterwards, I had 30 people come up to me and say the same thing. Wow, didn't make that connection. Now I tell this story because the private sector has amazing people at all different levels and all different businesses that are smart and capable and they have great resources and problem solving skills. They just need to apply what they have to their business, and oftentimes it can be a contributing factor to helping to make the world a better place. So in essence, human trafficking, big problem, but at the same time, if we could all collectively come together, it wouldn't have to be such a big problem. With that, I'll end. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Matt, for what a powerful message. And I know, thank you for, you clearly have lots and lots of stories and constrained yourself. So thank you. But the comments that you made, I think a couple of things that that really resonated with me that I think for those of us who, many of the people on this call actually work in this field and address this issue and live and breathe trying to make a difference. But for those of us lay people, if you will, some great lessons. And I think that understanding of, to your point, it is when and I have to fight this even in the US particularly, is when I say human trafficking, they immediately go to sex trafficking. And I have to pull people back and say, it's more than that, it's bigger than that. And we're looking at encompassing all that. So your perspective about kind of banks and manufacturing and retailers and hotels, hospitality is really important. Your comment or your story about Gita is, really struck me. And I think that that's why we exist as a club is, we are those good people who have done nothing and allow her to become that victim and make, have a trajectory in her life that she didn't ask for. And so, I think that that was a good reminder. I also really appreciated your comments about the private sector that, it really is. I've heard that story I've heard it from healthcare. I've heard it, talk to emergency room physicians who are trained in domestic abuse. And when they hear stories and get educated about human trafficking, they have that same epiphany of, I'm trained in this. I'm trained to look for signs. And I didn't make that connection from just that simple leap, if you will. It's a leap from I'm looking at a victim of domestic abuse to I'm looking at a victim of human trafficking. And so, helping us change our mindset are all really important lessons. So I'm going to turn it over. I don't know if we have any questions, but please, we will open it up to questions. Put your question in the chat so we can kind of process it effectively, and Michelle will facilitate that. So Michelle, are there any questions?
So we do have a question and comment from Jenny Almquist. This info is so good. We are going to be focusing on forced labor for a month with Fierce Freedom's podcast. She would like to ask you, Matt, if they can resource your information.
Absolutely. We have a whole slew of different tools that are available to individuals and organizations that are interested in forced labor and the relationship of forced labor in the private sector. You can go on to our website, the Mekong Club. Some of the tools are just for our association members, but many of them for people who are just learning about this are available to the general public. If you're interested, I'm happy to send some of our e-learning tools. They're like 3.5 minutes long, and they look at what are the statistics, what is the relationship between human trafficking and the private sector, supply chains, hospitality, or whatever. If you find those useful, I'm happy to share those. I have a TEDx that I do that's actually Where Were You? It's the same story that I told, but expanded. And, you know, we do talks all over the world. If you have an interest in talks within your organization, your company, or your community or whatever, it's what we do. It's I did 175 talks last year, and it's how we basically bridge the gap from people not knowing something to knowing something. And, you know, you can watch things, but it's better to have a human being talking to you, because at the end of these things, question and answer are always very important.
And you have a number of people in the chat saying thank you and appreciating your performance. So thank you very much. I will reiterate that. Kanalia does say in the comments that branding your group as the Mekong Club is a smart way to rebrand and not scare off business from participating. Rosie wanted to know if we are able to receive a copy of this presentation. I will say that yes, we are recording it, and we are working on a YouTube site where we're going to post things. So more to come on that. That is how we will be sharing this information, and Matt has given us permission to do that. And then I have from Janet. Oh yes, can you drop your website address or any links in the chat for us, if you don't mind? Or can we post your email address in the chat, or would you prefer people to go through us to get to you?
No, yeah, you can, if somebody can just put my email address on the chat, by all means, you know, send me an email, and I'm happy to respond back.
Okay,
I
I'm
am
doing
part
that now.
of Ragus, you know, and that's an amazing group. I met Rotarians back all the way in, I guess it was 2011 in Thailand when they had that big conference. And the very interesting thing about that is James Johnson, who's on here, asked me to do a presentation. And initially he said, can you do it for 3 hours? And I said, nobody would sit through it. I'll do an hour. And then I did an hour and they said, keep going. I did another hour, kept going, did another hour. It lasted about 4.5 hours. And so 70 people sat in the room the whole time. You know, it's just one of those amazing things. And I kind of fell in love with Rotary as a result of that.
And Cindy Sapoznik says, thank you, Matt. Something that I hear repeated on these victims, and she put that in quotes, is that the traffickers own the police, the lawyers, and the judges. What can we do with this part of the system?
Well, I mean, I'll tell you what we did in Nepal is we initially tried to address the bribery and the corruption. It was impossible. So what we did is we went and found police officers and judges and prosecutors who basically were sympathetic to it. And then we created the equivalent of a underground railroad of support. And so if a person was basically submitting that a crime took place at the district level, which what they had to do, an NGO person would be there, it would be submitted. And then 5 minutes later, they'd call up Kathmandu, the capital where these sympathetic people were. And before a bribe could be made, a call was made down to the district office to say, send that case to us. And so we went from almost zero convictions to 300 or 400 because we changed the system to ensure that it was fast-tracked, and at the same time, people who knew about the topic were involved. Those types of creative things can be done anywhere and everywhere. The other thing I should say is that I've worked in 42 countries, and some of those countries have a reputation of the cops being bad. Despite what you hear, there's always good cops, there's always bad cops, and there's a lot of cops somewhere in between. The percentage of that differs from place to place, but for the most part, there's always good people that you can find, you can tap into them, you can work with them, and that's what I always have done in my career.
Wonderful. From Alaka Kanalakar, and I'm sorry if I mispronounced that, how can this global issue be turned into a global movement whereby the private and public sector come together to eradicate it from the world?
You know, the film, The Inconvenient Truth, was a benchmark for helping people to understand the relevance of the climate change to them. Prior to that, people had heard it, but it didn't pull it together. I've always felt like what's needed is the equivalent of an inconvenient truth that doesn't go so much into it that it scares people away, because the problem with counter-trafficking topic is we made the mistake in the early days of just overwhelming people with doom and gloom and the horror of the situation. And then people started saying, well, I don't want to hear anything about that. And so what we need to do is to have an example of a person, and then to talk about like the systemic issues and stuff, but focus on hope, focus on the fact that we have ways of making a difference. We have ways of changing things in a direction that's really going to allow for us to be able to address this. In the absence of that sense of hope, then people don't want to have anything to do with it. The second thing is there are things that like individuals can do. They can learn about this and tell other people. They can be a part of these types of forums that offer volunteer opportunities. My youngest volunteer was 9 years old. This girl saw me in a documentary, contacted me and said, Mr. Friedman, I want to help. I said, you're 9 years old. She said, so what? I said, you're 9 years old. She said 9-year-olds were the new 16-year-olds. She said, give me a chance. And so basically, you know, I asked her what she wanted to do. She said she can find anything on the internet. Doesn't matter. I gave her an opportunity. She was better than my second-year Yale Law student interns because that was her thing. She used her skills and her ability. She applied it. If you can do that, if you have a skill, public speaking or writing or selling t-shirts, I don't care. You apply it to something. It's a win-win, because not only do you benefit, but everyone else benefits, and you know you're going to get so much more out of the experience. And so just encouraging people to realize that they don't have to quit their job and go to Cambodia to be a part of the solution. They can do small baby things. Those add up if 10 million people are doing it. And that's what we're trying to do. I've written a book called Be the Hero, Be the Change, and it just focuses on that particular topic of how the collective unity of people is going to be the thing that gets us through where we are now, not only with human trafficking, but everything else. There's not enough NGO people or UN people or government people to solve the issues of our time. We have to figure out what our issue is, own it, accept some responsibility, and do it. And the fact that you are all here, I assume your issue, you've been drawn to human trafficking. You don't know why. It's in your DNA. Some of us can't turn it off. It's just a part of who we are. I care about animal rights and various other things, but I'm always going to come back to this. I don't understand why. I don't need to understand why. This is where I'm going to be.
Susan Stiles asked what your funding sources are.
What my funding sources used to be. Actually, with COVID, I don't know if you guys know this, but the NGO world is being decimated. And in Hong Kong, we're going to lose 40% of our NGOs and all kinds of things. So we get donations from organizations. Our association fee is $7,000 a year, and that gives all of our tools and as many consultations and everything. But it's a tough time, you know. If anyone's interested in donating, by all means, we have a Give to Asia site. It's 501c3 friendly and so forth. But as a general statement, I think what you're going to see is at a time when modern slavery is increasing significantly, a percentage of counter-trafficking organizations, especially in this part of the world, won't exist. And that's a real problem, because you know, we lost probably 10 years of ground in a 1-year period. You know, I can tell you stories if we had time that would make the hair on the back of your neck go up, simply because there's so much desperation happening right now.
Simon John, first of all, says hi. Hi, Matt. Do you have or know of an approved standardized approach to pensions or investment holders to ask them to reform their investment policies?
Well, that's a very interesting thing. 5 years ago, I didn't know what ESG was, and now I spend 40% of my time focusing on this. I'm working with Reuters and a couple of other organizations. I think BlackRock is associated with a couple of others, to come up with kind of indicators within ESG on the S related to modern slavery. And so what you will see in March is that this will be launched, and the portfolios that major organizations have mostly focused on E and the G. Now it's going to be focusing on the S as well. And, you know, millennials care about this. There was a survey that was done a couple of years ago. 83% of the millennials think that this is a very important topic. They don't want any of their investments to go into a situation where it's funding forced labor. And they will also be managing something like $30 trillion in assets in the next 10 years. And so you're going to see more and more of an emphasis on businesses doing good as it relates to not only this topic, but for other topics. We have a paper that we did on ESG. We have another one coming out for investors in about 3 months. If you get on our mailing list, that'll be sent off to you. That'll be available to people, but it's certainly a very important topic. One other thing I wanted to say about that, there's an organization called the Noble. It's basically made up of KNOLBLE, and it's made up of financial people, you know, money transfer people, law enforcement people, and NGOs. It's getting a lot of momentum. It's doing great work. I happen to be on the board of them, so I know about them. I highly recommend them as an organization if you're looking for a volunteer opportunity or to link up your organization to a network that is moving towards kind of operationalizing the financial response to modern slavery.
And we have time for probably about 2 more questions, but I will draw everyone's attention to the chat. Matt's email is in there, as well as the link to the Mekong Club and a link to one of the books that you mentioned. So that information is in the chat. So peruse that in the last 10 minutes or so that we have here while Matt is answering questions. So Mike Martney asks if the Mekong Club is working with food ingredient supply chains.
Is it BSI? Is one of the big food networks has had me do a number of talks. I went to Texas to do a talk for kind of supply chains and foods and food ingredients and so forth. It was a keynote. It was a big event. I had a lot of people come up afterwards. BSI, you know, had me write a paper. I think it's about 10 pages on that particular topic. For those who are interested, if you send me an email, I'll go ahead and send it back to you if I can find it. But it's you know, the thing about human trafficking is that, you know, for a long time, the light was focused on sex trafficking, and then it went on fishing, and then it's now manufacturing. But, you know, I'm having talks with tech organizations. Facebook is facing all kinds of issues because people are being recruited on Facebook. Airbnb, they have pop-up brothels. You have pharmaceutical companies that don't think they have an issue until they realize that the people who distribute their drugs are third-party contractors that are being exploited. Went to a law firm. They said, well, we don't have anything to do with this. And I said, well, who cleans your building? And they looked into it and they realized that there was forced labor associated with that. You keep pointing the light in a particular direction, you're going to see all kinds of stuff. You know, we just don't have the resources to address all of them. But the point is this is systemic and it's in so many different areas. And, you know, eventually over time, you're going to see it entering into just about every industry.
And for our next question, I'm going to kind of combine what Mary and Alcala have asked, which Mary specifically says, I live in Minnesota and how can I help? But the other question is, how can Rotary International help with such an enormous reach that it has apart from spreading the message of awareness and advocacy? Can we help as Rotarians to do more?
You know, I mean, Rotary would be a natural organization to take this on like they did with polio. And, you know, there's a certain number of people on this call who know that, and that discussion has taken place. It has every element of injustice. It relates to poverty and health and education and lack of freedom and human rights, everything in one. It is it's almost like the funnel of all the bad stuff gets to the bottom and it gets condensed into what's modern slavery. You know, the Ragus element within Rotary is an amazing organization. It's done a lot, but, you know, every time I get in front of a Rotary Club anywhere in the world, and I do as many of these talks as I can, I'm always shocked at how much people's hearts and minds and souls and the compassionate sense of them comes out. They recognize that what we're dealing with here is very bad and it has to be addressed. And so I just think if if we can just continue to do what we're doing with this particular club that has an emphasis on this particular topic, it's so important. Get other clubs to learn from you, to benefit from you, to do similar things in other locations. I really think that that has the potential to add so much value. 1.2 million people in your networks. Wow, that's a huge number of people. Think about how much good could happen if you could get each of those people to do one thing a year, just one thing a year. That's 1.2 million small gestures that would really add up to something big. As long as I believe that, as long as I really embrace that thought that we will eventually get to a point where we know exactly what to do. And I feel like with some of these projects and some of these elements that are coming together, and let me just say, amazing things are happening in North America. Things that, you know, all over the world they could benefit. You know, the fact that you are in these different locations around the world, no matter what, we need to get those lessons learned out to people. We need to, and let me just not say it's not just North America, it's all over the world, Africa, Asia, whatever. The best of what's out there needs to be transmitted. We have to emphasize that from that hope will result. But hope is really kind of an idea with action leads to hope. You know, there's a lot of people that are wishing for the day this is going to go away. It's not. You have to do something for that to happen. And the doers are the ones that are going to be the ones that get us across the line to the catalytic point where eventually we get to a point where we achieve what we need to achieve. And I believe that in my heart of hearts.
Just the power of Rotary, the 1.2 million people, it's, you know, as we build this club, as we're forming this club, I keep looking at the model of polio. And I think from that compassion fatigue, Matt, I think, you know, when I get discouraged, because I'm a very goal-oriented action person and I want to get things done, and I look at what we've accomplished and I think, you know, it's so little in such a great amount of time, you know, thinking 6 months. I really am I'm also encouraged that for polio, which was not easy to eradicate, but it was a pretty straightforward cause and effect and solution. It's taken us over 40 years to be able to eradicate polio. So I do get hopeful about, okay, if it took 40 years for polio, it's going to take a while for us to end human trafficking around the globe, but we have to start with those small steps. So thank you. Thanks again, Matt. I also thanks all of you for joining. I hope that this was interesting to you, beneficial for those of you who have not been a member of Rotary and this is intriguing to you. We would love to have you consider joining our club. Come to a couple of our other meetings. We have a great lineup, as I said, I think through May. So just powerful speakers as you look through our list. So as we close each of our meetings, our Rotary meetings, with the 4-way test that is really kind of our guiding principles for Rotary and brings all of us 1.2 million people together on a regular basis. So I would encourage you to join us. We always say this together. So as we close our meeting, please say the 4-way test with me. In the things we think, say, and do, is it the truth?
Is it the truth?
Number 2,
Is it
fair to all
concerned?
3, will it build
goodwill and better
friendships?
friendships?
Will it be beneficial?
And number 4,
Will it be beneficial to all concerned?
thank you all. Have a great rest of the week. Take the messages that we learned today and be inspired. So we'll see you next time, our next meeting.